Metal. You know it, you love it, maybe you hate it. In that case, you probably should not be watching this video. But for those who do love heavy music as much as I do, you may be confused on just how many styles and subgenres there are. You might hear something like sludge or grindcore and be like, isn't that what I dropped in the toilet this morning? These words sound made up. And you would be right, they are made up. But they're very important on understanding how exactly metal came to be and helps you to understand the differences between these styles. They are all unique in their own way and they all offer a lot to the genre. Many people like to fuse these styles, take some elements from other bands of the style and make their own thing. It's not trying to put artists in a box, it's just trying to explain exactly where they come from so we can appreciate our favorite metal musicians better. If you like this video, be sure to smash that like button. You can also leave me a hate comment if you want me to cry myself to sleep at night. We're starting with the classics here. So this is referring to traditional classic heavy metal. A lot of people use the term metal and heavy metal interchangeably. However, to the metal community, when you say heavy metal, they're going to think the classic style. So what do I mean by this? Traditional heavy metal has very driving, distorted, but melodic guitar riffs, clean vocals, very powerful, roaring vocal performances, and its fair share of epic guitar solos. I'm talking, these people love their guitar solos. They'll go up and down. Blah, 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 blah. Heavy metal directly evolved from hard rock and psychedelic rock in the 60s and was pioneered by bands like Black Sabbath and Deep Purple. They used very dark thematic imagery while having these crushingly heavy riffs, especially for the time. Listen to Black Sabbath's Into the Void. That stuff is heavier than any band could wish to be. However, these bands still retain some of the blues influence of hard rock. It wasn't until later where British bands like Judas Priest and Motorhead kind of really took heavy metal to the next edge. Judas Priest kind of exemplified what heavy metal was to come. Operatic clean vocals, really flashy guitar solos, and a focus on really heavy riffs. Breaking the law, breaking the law, breaking the law, breaking the law. A lot of the times these riffs are palm muted, basically covering like the bridge of the guitar with your palm in order to just have this really metallic sound. That kind of characterizes a lot of classic metal riffs, and Judas Priest was kind of one to really pioneer that. Heavy metal really came into its own with the new wave of British heavy metal, bands like Iron Maiden, Lightning Head, Angel Witch. These bands evolved completely past the blues influence and actually took a lot from progressive rock. You get all those classic tenets of heavy metal, those operatic, loud, clean singing vocals, as well as these heavy, palm-muted, eighth-note guitar riffs. Very driving drum rhythms, too. Classic heavy metal isn't as popular as it used to be, but it definitely influenced a lot of styles today. Melodic death metal owes a lot to classic metal. Melodic metalcore as well. And you have plenty of bands that are still carrying the torch for the style, like Trivium and Avenged Sevenfold, who are making it a very contemporary, modern sound. Thrash metal is where metal really started to get extreme. It evolved from the faster speed metal of new wave of British heavy metal bands like Venom. And upped the ante by including hardcore punk influence. You can hear that in the harsh, biting vocals, that skank, skippy drumming, and the chugging breakdowns. Thrash metal came about around the early 1980s in the metal underground, and a lot of the big names of metal today were thrash bands. Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Anthrax. These were really big in the US. But you also have Teutonic thrash metal from the German scene, like Creator and Sodom. There are bands that might dabble in a more technical side of things, dubbed technical thrash metal. I know it sounds like a nerd's wet dream. It is. But listen to bands like Corner and Voivod. These bands are crazy technical, but they're very true to the thrash sound. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have crossover thrash. Thrash metal already had influence from hardcore punk, but crossover directly fuses hardcore and thrash metal. It mostly came from the hardcore scene, and bands like SOD and Carnivore exemplified this style. Very simplified thrash riffing and more pure hardcore vocals, but still that thrash down-tuned chugging energy. Thrash metal kind of faded in popularity, and you don't see it as often nowadays with more mainstream metal acts, but you still see it crop up here now and again, and it's very active in the underground. You have the 2000s pizza thrash, and you also have bands like Vector who are doing a new, unique take on the style. While thrash metal continued to ramp up the speed of heavy metal, doom metal took the opposite route and took directly from bands like Black Sabbath with very slow moving riffs and extremified that. The tempos are slower. There's ringing, dissonant chords, and it's very, very sparse drumming. Doom metal really wants to focus on a crushing, gloomy atmosphere. You may see people argue that Sabbath was the first doom band. And while that could be true in a case, it didn't really start until bands of the new wave of British heavy metal like Pagan Altar and Witchfinder in general began to take Black Sabbath's formula and really codified it into a slow moving style. This led to traditional doom metal bands in the 1980s like Candlemass or Trouble or St. Vitus. They really honed in on this slow-moving retro sound.
Made it even slower.
Every time I'm on the street, hate is my only friend, pain is my father.
It didn't stay in solitude for long. It did eventually grow out of its shell and fuse with other genres or spawn new ones like stoner or sludge metal. You have several subgenres of doom metal, such as death doom metal, which takes elements from death metal like double kick drumming, growling, and rapid tempo changes, and applies it to the slow-moving doom formula. Another subgenre is funeral doom metal, which is
Even slower.
sometimes reaching the thresholds of 50, 60 BPM, really slow moving stuff. And a lot of funeral doom metals will have synthesizer flourishes, trying to mimic a very funereal atmosphere. Bands today take a variety of different approaches to doom metal, but a lot of the popular ones will take just a purely atmospheric, reverb-heavy sound, which a lot of people just call a pure doom metal sound. Bands like Pallbearer or Warning are really good examples of this. Now, you may have heard of death metal before, but it is a very specific style. It took from the more extreme end of thrash metal and evolved from there. Bands like Slayer, Celtic Frost, and Creator really helped shape the death metal sound to come. But death metal proper started with the Florida scene, bands like Death, Morbid Angel, Autopsy. They added in double kick drumming, growled and screeched vocals, dark, heavy, swampy production, and a lot of erratic, rapid tempo changes and blast beats. If you don't know what a blast beat is, here's one. It's pretty intense stuff, and it's in a lot of forms of extreme metal. Another thing that separates it from classic metal is that the solos are very dissonant and chaotic. They're not always melodic and soaring over the music. There are several styles of death metal, such as technical death metal, brutal/slam death metal, melodic death metal, which kind of became its own thing entirely, blackened death metal, and even death and roll, which sounds hilarious, and sometimes it is. Death metal is a huge genre today. Many bands are taking new and interesting approaches with the style. Take bands like Ulcerate, who add a lot of more atmospheric passages to death metal, which it wasn't very common before. So there's a lot of new exciting things happening in the style. Black metal. This one's a little bit of a interesting one because it has two different waves, but we'll go over the typical black metal sound. A lot of what people associate with black metal is lo-fi recording. So something that sounds like it was recorded in a trash can. Shrieking, buried vocal styles, a lot of just really high-pitched, trebly mixing. Black metal also prides itself on its wintry cold atmosphere, with tremolo picking and blast beats being very common. And typically in the traditional sense, satanic or pagan themes were very prevalent, although black metal today has all sorts of lyrical themes, so it's not necessarily a core tenet of the style. First wave black metal was a little more disparate. It included bands like Bathory, which came from more of the speed metal thrash end of things, but took things into a more raw underground direction with a very satanic, shrieking vocal style. Norwegian black metal scene in the late 80s and early 90s, otherwise known as its second wave, really honed in on the stylistic conventions and kind of defined what we see as black metal today. Unfortunately, we do have to discuss its rather unfortunate connections to Nazi ideology, but I want to really stress that Nazi ideology does not characterize all black metal bands. A very small portion of bands are tied to this terrible worldview. And many bands like Panopticon go directly against this idea in their music. So don't let that deter you from listening to black metal, because there's a lot to love in the genre. Just always research the band first is all I'm saying. Black metal spawns several subgenres, such as atmospheric black metal, melodic black metal, war metal, which took influence from grindcore, depressive suicidal black metal, which sounds really made up, and it is. Symphonic black metal, and more. Black metal bands continue to experiment with the genre and fusing it with stuff like ambient, noise, shoegaze, a lot of cool new approaches to the style every so often. And now black metal is no longer tied to any sort of ideology. There's all sorts of different types of bands that come from different backgrounds, which I think is really cool. If you're a fan of progressive rock, you're gonna like progressive metal. It basically takes a lot of elements from progressive rock and fuses it with heavy metal riffs. I know that sounds very obvious, but shut up. Progressive metal is very technical, has a lot of uncommon time signatures and polyrhythmic sections and really grandiose classical influence song structures. However, it's not a very specific style. There's plenty of bands of a variety of different lineages that take a progressive metal direction. You have the classic stuff like Dream Theater and Queensryche, which came directly from a classic metal background. But you also have bands that came more from death metal, like Opeth and Gojira. or just a unique contemporary or groovy sound like Mastodon. Metal has always taken from progressive rock, even all the way back to Sabbath, but this takes it to a whole new ante. If you're a nerd, listen to bands like Hackin', Animals as Leaders, and progressive metalcore bands like Between the Buried and Me, and get lost in the sauce of that crazy technical metal style. It also spawned Gent, which we're just not going to talk about that. Groove metal is everybody's favorite thing to hate, but I actually love a lot of groove metal. It came from slowing down thrash riffs into a very syncopated, mid-tempo, groovy style. You're going to see a lot of repetitive, gruff riffs with tough guy hardcore vocals. It started from bands like Pantera, who were directly inspired and came from thrash, just very slowed down and groovified, if you will. Pantera style proved to be influential to bands like Machine Head and Prong and Five Finger Death Punch. Like I said, I like a lot of the style, not all of it. And groove metal overall just became a big influence on mainstream metal to come. Like I said, it's not so hip to like now, but there's still plenty of bands that carry groove influence in a lot of unique ways. Meshuggah, I think, has a lot of groove influence that people don't give it credit for. So when I said that doom took a different direction from thrash and didn't include all of that punk influence, it was bound to at some point. Sludge metal is kind of the answer to what if doom metal and hardcore punk came together. There are noisy, chaotic, but very slow guitar riffs. It combines doom's slow, intense pacing with hardcore's aggression. Sludge actually started more from hardcore punk rather than metal. A lot of punk bands like Flipper and Black Flag, specifically on their album My War, pioneered this sound and influenced metal bands to come. Take Melvins or Buzz Oven. It was also very influential on the New Orleans scene of bands like I Hate God and Acid Bath. You have bands that took a more atmospheric approach like Neurosis, have very climactic passages but still those slow, crushing riffs. And sludge has also crossed over with a variety of genres, such as its origin point, doom, or stoner metal and metalcore. A lot of people will also call bands like Mastodon and Baroness sludge metal, although I don't know if I really agree. Maybe that's a video for another point. That's kind of a controversial hot take, but I don't personally consider those bands sludge metal. But if you want to consider them sludge metal, that is perfectly okay. I will only hate you a little bit. Sludge metal is very popular today and has even gotten some exposure in the mainstream. It's a very respected genre that a lot of bands take from today. Power metal, power metal. So power metal technically refers to two styles of music, but when people say power metal, they're referring to the one that started in Europe. It's an even more melodic derivative of the classic metal sound. It kind of takes everything about classic metal and takes it to a sweetening degree. Vocals are even more high-pitched and clean and soaring over the music. You have fast tempos, fantastical or even historical lyricism, sometimes with very folkish or symphonic instrumentation, and it's even occasionally in major keys. It's basically positive metal. Now, the other power metal is an American genre. It's more of a micro genre, so we're not going to get into that today, but you should check out some American power metal. However, you don't have to be European to play in the European style of power metal. There's plenty of American bands or bands from other places that play power metal. It started with speed metal bands like Halloween and then eventually expanded to bands like Blind Guardian. Power metal has a very dedicated fan base today, and you see bands like Sabaton and Powerwolf have dedicated cult followings.
In the night we can rest, in the dark we are best.
Power metal bands really are icons for history majors everywhere.
We wait for the day, for the night so wasted and gone.
So in this, I'm including all of the subgenres like nu metal and funk metal and rap metal. They all have their own unique quirks, but they all belong to the alternative metal umbrella. Alternative metal became a really mainstream form of rock music that fused elements of alternative rock, especially the grunge-oriented sound of the early 90s, with heavy metal, hip-hop, funk, and it created this very mid-tempo, syncopated, accessible form of metal. You'll see a mixture of harsh and clean vocals in a lot of alt metal bands, and the riffing style is very different from classic metal. There's a lot of chugging, extremely down-tuned riffs. You'll see drop A or drop D very commonly in alt metal, and a lot of it is very just like one-note chugging type style.
I don't shoot you, just give it a smile.
This has led to alt metal being controversially labeled as metal. Some more elitist types might not see it as metal proper, while others completely defend alt metal. I feel like I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. It really depends on the band. Some of them are really kind of strayed very far from metal, like Linkin Park.
And got so far, but in the end, it doesn't even matter.
While others are very obviously metal, like System of a Down.
They're trying to build a prison, they're trying to build a prison, they're trying to build a prison. So you let me do the thing, another prison.
However, this distinction doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things because all that matters is the music. Alt metal started in the 1980s with bands like Faith No More, who really influenced alt metal bands of the future. But alt metal would really explode in popularity in the 90s and 2000s. Bands like System of a Down, Tool, Deftones.
It's not that I care.
And then nu metal would receive a lot of radio play, and many of you are probably aware of nu metal and might have a disdain for it, but I guarantee you there's a lot of great music there. Of course, you've heard the big nu metal names: Korn, Limp Bizkit, Slipknot.
I push my fingers until
But there are also other bands that maybe you should check out. Alt metal is very broad and has crossed over into a lot of different genres. So there's not really one brush that you can paint the entirety of alt metal with, but there are a few stylistic conventions. Alt metal got really oversaturated, especially in the MTV days of the 2000s, but it's really had an extremely revived interest, especially recently, where bands like Deftones are getting newfound popularity. Bands like Fleshwater are heavily influenced by this more dreamlike sound. This is probably perhaps one of the biggest metal genres of all time, both mainstream and underground. There's been so much success in the metalcore sphere, maybe at a point where you might have heard a little bit too much of it if you're into metal at all. Metalcore is characterized by the breakdown section of the music. If you don't know what a breakdown sounds like, here's a metalcore breakdown. There's also very chugging riffs and hardcore vocals. It's basically a fusion, like the name says, of heavy metal styles and hardcore styles. Just like alt metal, this has led to a lot of contention within the metal sphere, whether this constitutes as metal or whether some metalcore bands are metal and others aren't. Really does not matter. It grew out of the old school tough guy hardcore scene, youth crew bands like Judge, as well as crossover thrash bands, as aforementioned in the thrash metal section. You have old school metallic hardcore bands that are more true to that hardcore style, like Integrity and Earth Crisis.
You have moved that poison.
while early metallic hardcore bands like Rorschach, fuck that pronunciation up, would influence mathcore bands like the Dillinger Escape Plan, Converge, and Psyopus. Very technical, demanding metalcore music.
Everything's fine. Bet on yourself.
Metalcore really boosted its popularity in the 2000s when it started to get a lot of influence from heavy metal and melodic death metal and formed the melodic metalcore style, which doesn't have to have melodic clean singing, but it's all about those melodic traditional riffs. Bands like Killswitch Engage, Bullet for My Valentine, and As I Lay Dying began to be really huge in terms of mainstream success.
The truth is absolution.
You also see metalcore often fusing with post-hardcore and scene music. You'll see bands like Under Oath that are very popular in scene circles that often use metalcore breakdowns. Another prominent subgenre of metalcore is deathcore, which took more from brutal and slam death metal. This was very clowned on in the 2000s, but I encourage you to look back at deathcore. There's a lot of really good stuff to find. Of course, you have your Suicide Silence, your Despised Icon, Thy Art is Murder. Bands in the metalcore sphere have gone all sorts of directions. You have more progressive bands, to new metalcore, which takes a lot of elements from alt and new metal. This is for all of you weed smokers out there, but also people who just want to enjoy some good heavy music. It came from doom metal and 70s heavy psychedelic rock and fused the two together to create this very heavy, repetitive, and blues-based riffing. It's kind of different from a lot of metal styles in the fact that it retains a lot of blues of classic styles. The bass is usually mixed very highly just to give that very buzzing sensation. Usually stoner metal is pretty slow or mid-tempo, and it's just a very dense, distorted sound. It started in the early 90s with bands like Caius and Sleep, who took those elements of doom and psychedelic rock and created their own hypnotic style that would define stoner metal. Then you have the big hitters like Electric Wizard or Bongzilla. This created the term stoner doom, which kind of puts it in a position where it's like a subgenre of doom metal. I wouldn't really say that because there's plenty of counter examples to that narrative. Take High on Fire, which is definitely not a doom band. It has a little bit of a quicker pacing, but definitely still stoner. And it's not exclusively weed lyrics. Despite the name, there's a lot of stoner metal bands that have nothing to do with weed lyricism, like Elder. Here's another one that came from doom metal. Wow, doom metal really influenced a lot of stuff. Gothic metal came from the doom sound as well as a more symphonic metal-based sound and fused post-punk and gothic rock elements, especially its atmospheric keys and reverberated guitars. It created a very sorrowful, very doomish sound. Typically, you'll find clean vocals in a gothic metal track, but it also can include plenty of harsh ones as well. You'll have a lot of orchestrated instrumentation, very grandiose, but also very desolate. Gothic metal bands love their guitar effects, reverb, delay, flanges, choruses. They love them. It creates this very thick post-punk atmosphere. It started in the 1990s with bands like Paradise Lost and Typo Negative. and as well as melodic death doom bands like Catatonia and My Dying Bride. And it's since been fused with a lot of different genres like black metal. A lot of classic goth metal bands kind of abandoned the sound later on and turned to a more soft style like alternative rock, but it still carries on today with many bands still carrying the torch. Industrial metal utilizes a lot of harsh electronics as well as drum machines instead of a traditional metal drummer, and you'll also see samples in the music as well. Industrial metal bands are trying to create a very cold, mechanical feel to the music. You'll see this by their resampling of guitar riffs, kind of chopping it up and splicing it, and mechanical samples. Even the vocals aren't immune to this harsh electronic-based sound. You'll often see vocals put through a distortion pedal or a distortion box. It began in the 90s post-industrial movement that cross-pollinated with metal and took from heavier industrial-based bands like Swans and Sonic Youth while still maintaining heavy, groovy riffs. You see this with bands like Godflesh, Ministry, Fear Factory, and Rammstein. Eventually, industrial metal would go to cross over to a number of different genres. You see bands like Static X that were very popular when nu metal came about and had a lot of industrial elements. While you also see other bands fuse industrial metal with death and black metal. Folk metal is exactly what it sounds like. It fuses traditional folk instrumentation with heavy riffs. Typically, European-style folk music will be in the foray, or Celtic music, but it also has included numerous other folk traditions, ranging from East Asian or even Indigenous American. It started with bands like Skyclad and would go on to include bands like Orphaned Land, Subway to Sally, which pioneered medieval metal, and Fintroll and Moonsorrow. This is honestly a subgenre that I'm not as familiar with as opposed to the others, but there's still a lot of interesting takes that I've seen from the genre, fusing with black metal or more experimental sounds. Post-metal evolved alongside post-rock and created this very climactic, cinematic, and atmospheric sound. There is less of a focus on riffing and more of a focus on timbral experimentation, very textured and very avant-garde. You'll usually see slower, more quiet, even melodic sections crescendo into these explosive, heavy sections. It's very evocative stuff. It initially grew from sludge bands experimenting with less heavy sections, such as Neurosis, and fully began to be its own style in the 2000s. I'd say Isis, Pelican, and Cult of Luna are kind of classic examples of the style. But they have fused with all sorts of other genres such as black, sludge, doom, and many more. You'll see a lot of post-metal bands nowadays like Russian Circles or black gaze bands like Death Heaven use a very atmospheric post-metal based sound. And it's a very cool genre that I think should get more attention. I feel like Grindcore should come with a warning before listening because this stuff is pretty extreme. It fuses punk and metal with blast beats, extreme tempos, very sloppy playing, and disgusting vocals. It might be the most extreme metal or punk concoction ever made. Usually grindcore songs are in and out. You would be lucky to see a grindcore song reach the minute mark. And that kind of fits with the style because it is a lot to handle. It initially grew out of the 80s crust punk scene while mixing in thrash and death metal riffing. You'll see this with bands like Repulsion and the UK's Napalm Death. But it grew into prominence in the 90s and 2000s. Listen to bands like Pig Destroyer, Nasum, Insect Warfare, and Magruder Grind, and you'll see that really fast, heavy, skippy, sloppy style. Grindcore has gone on to even more extreme, noisy, and terrifying territory, sometimes fusing with death metal or metalcore. There's a lot of subgenres, some of which I'm not even going to say out loud, but you have gore grind, noise grind, death grind, and white belt as some of the major subgenres. Sometimes bands don't really fit into any box at all other than extremely fucking weird. That's avant/experimental metal for you. Whether it be bizarre compositional elements, weird genre fusions, or just plain wacky ideas. Some bands will push the metal formula to its limits. Avant-garde metal will change depending on the time period and depending on who's listening, but you've had innovative bands like Voivod, Celtic Frost, Mr. Bungle, Today is the Day, Gorguts, Psy, Sun, who pioneered drone metal. Bands have had a hard time really replicating this sound, and they still stay avant-garde. Modern avant-garde metal has gone in all sorts of different directions, such as bands like Aransi Pazuzu, which have electronic and psychedelic textures. Liturgy with an experimental transcendental black metal codified sound. Or Effluence, who basically play improvised, gory death metal. Maybe this helped you understand metal genres better, maybe it didn't, but if it did, be sure to subscribe to the channel and get more content that talks about music. I wanted to create some kind of a looser video. It's been a while since I've posted, and I wanted something that was a little more unscripted, but if you want to see these genres explored a little further into scripted content, let me know because I would love to make one. Side note, I also have a linked playlist below of 2 examples of each style, so you can get a good feel of what each genre has to offer. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye!